At 27, Allison Jenkins had learned to measure her breathing in the presence of others. She stood now in the cramped bathroom of the downtown Seattle office building, staring at the plastic stick that had just rewritten her future in 2 pink lines. In 6 hours, she would go home to the apartment she shared with Marcus Webb, the man she'd married 8 months ago. She would tell him about the baby, and then everything would change. Before we dive into today's storytelling session, tell us where you are watching from and add like and subscribe to this video so we can continue bringing you these compelling narratives. Victoria Webb had moved in with them 3 weeks ago after Marcus's father's sudden death. What began as temporary support during grief had transformed their small apartment into something that felt more like a boarding house where Allison was the least welcome guest. Victoria was 58, a woman who wore her widowhood like armor and approached every aspect of life with the efficiency of someone accustomed to keeping schedules and solving problems. Unfortunately, Allison had become one of the problems that needed solving. The changes came gradually. Victoria rearranged the kitchen cabinets, replaced the shower curtain without asking, and began cooking dinners that catered to Marcus's childhood favorites. Privacy became a memory. Victoria walked into their bedroom without knocking, commenting on Allison's choice of undergarments and reading habits. When Allison tried to talk to Marcus about his mother's intrusive behavior, he deflected. "She's just trying to help. She lost Dad. We need to be patient." But patience was not an infinite resource. When she opened the apartment door that evening, the conversation stopped abruptly. Marcus looked up from the couch where he sat beside his mother, a legal pad covered in notes balanced on his knee. "You're late," Victoria observed. "I was beginning to worry." Victoria cleared her throat. "We need to talk about your future." Marcus reached for his legal pad covered with apartment listings and budget breakdowns. "We've been looking at places. Larger apartments, better neighborhoods." "I think," Victoria interrupted, "that it's time for you to consider your responsibilities. You're a married couple, and married couples need to plan for the future." Victoria's smile was sharp and satisfied. "The kind that includes children, dear. I've been watching you, and I know the signs. The fatigue, the nausea, the way you've been picking at your food. How far along are you?" The question hit Allison like cold water. "I'm not." "Don't insult my intelligence," Victoria said. "I know what a pregnant woman looks like." Marcus stared at Allison. "Are you?" "Yes," she said finally. "I found out today." Victoria clapped her hands together. "I knew it. This changes everything. The apartment search becomes urgent now. You can't raise a baby in this place." The conversation accelerated beyond Allison's control. Victoria produced real estate listings, apartments with rents nearly double what they currently paid. "It's too expensive," Allison said, but her voice was lost beneath Victoria's descriptions of walk-in closets and updated appliances. "I need to think about this," she said, standing up. "Think about what, dear?" "We're talking about your baby's welfare." "I need some air," Allison said, moving toward the door. Victoria's voice followed her. "The neighborhood isn't safe for a pregnant woman to be walking alone." "I'll be fine," she said, stepping into the hallway. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of rain and fallen leaves from the trees that lined their street. Allison walked without direction, letting her feet carry her through the familiar neighborhood while her mind struggled to process the events of the past hour. She was going to be a mother. The reality felt both enormous and impossible, like trying to hold an ocean in her hands. For months, she and Marcus had been trying to conceive, marking calendars and taking vitamins and making love with the mechanical precision of people working toward a goal. But now that the goal had been achieved, the reality felt overwhelming rather than joyful. How could she raise a child when she felt like a child herself, lost and confused in the face of Victoria's certainty and Marcus's eager compliance? How could she teach her son or daughter to have a voice when hers had been steadily disappearing since the day Victoria moved in? The streets were quiet in the early evening, punctuated by the occasional car passing and the distant sound of television programs filtering through apartment windows. Allison found herself walking toward the small park 3 blocks from their building, a space with a single bench and a view of the city skyline that had always calmed her during stressful times. She sat down on the bench and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found her sister's number. Rebecca lived in Portland, 2 hours away but somehow part of a different world entirely. She was 3 years older than Allison, unmarried by choice, and possessed the kind of fierce independence that Allison had always admired but never managed to cultivate. The phone rang twice before Rebecca's familiar voice came through the speaker. "Hey, stranger. What's up?" "I'm pregnant," Allison said, the words spilling out before she could reconsider. The silence on the other end stretched just long enough for Allison to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Rebecca's voice returned, warm and immediate. "Holy shit. That's huge. How are you feeling about it?" The question was so simple, so focused on Allison's own experience rather than anyone else's expectations, that she felt tears beginning to form. "Scared," she admitted. "Overwhelmed. Marcus is excited, and his mother is already planning our entire future, and I feel like I'm watching my life happen to someone else." "His mother is still living with you?" "Yeah. And it's—" Allison struggled to find words that could capture the suffocating weight of Victoria's presence. "She's taken over everything. The apartment, the decisions, even this pregnancy. She figured it out before I could even tell Marcus myself." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, and Allison could picture her sister's face, the way her eyebrows drew together when she was thinking through a problem. "That's fucked up," Rebecca said finally. "You deserve to have control over your own news, your own body, your own space." The validation felt like water to someone dying of thirst. For weeks, Allison had been questioning her own perceptions, wondering if she was being unreasonable or overly sensitive. Victoria's behavior always came wrapped in concern and good intentions, making it difficult to articulate why it felt so wrong. "She means well," Allison said, repeating the phrase that had become her automatic defense of Victoria's intrusions. "So what?" Rebecca's voice sharpened with indignation. "Meaning well doesn't give her the right to run your life. You're an adult woman, not a child who needs managing." The words hit home with surprising force. Allison realized that she had been feeling increasingly like a child in her own life, subject to rules and expectations imposed by someone who claimed to know better. Victoria's management style might have worked in her dental practice, but applied to Allison's personal life, it felt like suffocation. "I don't know what to do," Allison confessed. "Marcus won't stand up to her. Every time I try to talk to him about boundaries, he says she's grieving and we need to be patient." "Grief doesn't entitle someone to control your pregnancy," Rebecca said bluntly. "And patience has limits. How long is she planning to stay?" "I don't know. It started as temporary, just until she figured out what to do next. But now she's talking about us finding a bigger apartment, like she's planning to be part of our permanent living situation." The thought made Allison's chest tight with panic. She tried to imagine raising a child under Victoria's constant supervision, every decision subject to the older woman's approval or criticism. The idea of Victoria commenting on her parenting choices, reorganizing the nursery according to her own preferences, treating Allison's child as another project to be managed, felt like a nightmare. "You need to set boundaries," Rebecca said firmly. "Real ones with consequences. And if Marcus won't support you, then you need to consider what that means for your marriage." The suggestion hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Allison wasn't ready to examine too closely. She loved Marcus, or she thought she did. But the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had listened to her opinions and respected her independence, seemed to have disappeared the moment his mother moved in. "I can't leave him," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm pregnant. Where would I go?" "You could come here," Rebecca offered immediately. "I have a spare room and Portland has good health care. You could get on your feet, figure out what you want your life to look like." The offer was tempting in a way that surprised Allison. She had never seriously considered leaving Seattle, had built her adult life around the assumption that she and Marcus would create a future together. But sitting on the park bench with the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance, she found herself imagining a different kind of life, one where her voice mattered, where her choices were her own. "I need to think," she said finally. "Of course you do. But don't take too long, okay? Every day you wait is another day of letting them make decisions about your life without your input." After they hung up, Allison sat in the gathering darkness, her hand resting unconsciously on her stomach. The baby inside her was still too small to feel, still more concept than reality. But already its existence was reshaping the world around her, creating new pressures and expectations that felt beyond her control. She thought about the apartment listings Victoria had spread across their coffee table, the way Marcus had nodded along with his mother's plans as if Allison's preferences were irrelevant. She thought about the kitchen that no longer felt like hers, the bathroom where privacy had become a memory, the bedroom where Victoria knocked without waiting for permission to enter. Most of all, she thought about the child she was carrying and the kind of mother she wanted to be. Did she want to raise a daughter who learned to make herself small in the face of stronger personalities? Did she want to teach a son that women's voices mattered less than the comfort of avoiding conflict? The questions felt too large for the small park bench, too complex for an evening walk. But they would demand answers soon, whether she felt ready or not. Victoria's presence had accelerated everything, transforming what should have been a joyful discovery into another point of contention and control. As Allison walked back toward the apartment, she made herself a promise. She would find her voice again somehow. She would reclaim her space, her choices, her right to shape her own future. The child growing inside her deserved a mother who knew how to stand up for herself, how to set boundaries, how to create a home where everyone's needs mattered. The apartment building came into view, its windows glowing with warm light that no longer felt welcoming. Allison climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached their door, she could hear voices inside, Marcus and Victoria discussing something with the kind of animated energy that suggested important decisions were being made. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, keys in her hand, gathering the courage to enter her own home. When she finally opened the door, she found them exactly where she had left them, surrounded by apartment listings and budget calculations, planning a future that had somehow become theirs to decide. "There you are," Victoria said, looking up with relief that felt performative. "We were getting worried. It's not safe for a pregnant woman to be out after dark." Marcus rose from the couch, his expression mixing concern with something that might have been guilt. "Are you feeling better?" Allison closed the door behind her and leaned against it, studying the scene before her. The coffee table was now covered with more papers, rental applications, neighborhood crime statistics, school district rankings. Victoria had been busy during her absence, expanding their research into a comprehensive relocation plan. "We've made some progress," Marcus said, gesturing toward the papers with enthusiasm that felt forced. "Mom found a few more options, and I think we can make the numbers work if we're careful with our budget." The casual assumption that their decision had already been made hit Allison like a physical blow. She had been gone for less than 2 hours, but in that time her future had been mapped out by people who seemed to have forgotten that she was the one carrying the child that was driving all these changes. "I haven't agreed to move anywhere," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Victoria's expression shifted, surprise giving way to the kind of patient condescension reserved for children who didn't understand their own best interests. "Dear, we've been over this. The apartment is too small for a baby. You need proper space, good schools, a safe neighborhood." "I need to be part of the conversation," Allison replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "These are decisions about my life, my child, my future. I should have a say in what happens." Marcus frowned, his discomfort obvious. "Of course you have a say. We're just trying to be practical. Mom has experience with these things." The phrase "these things" hung in the air like an accusation. Pregnancy, motherhood, the vast category of female experiences that Victoria had navigated and mastered while Allison remained a novice. The implication was clear. In matters of maternal wisdom, Victoria's voice carried more weight than the woman actually carrying the child. I have experience too, Allison said, though her voice wavered slightly. This is my body, my pregnancy, my child. Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Experience? Dear, this is your first pregnancy. You have no idea what you're in for. The sleepless nights, the constant worry, the way a baby changes everything. You'll need all the help you can get. The word help carried the same loaded meaning it always did in Victoria's vocabulary. Not assistance offered and accepted, but management imposed from above. Help that came with conditions, expectations, and the gradual erosion of personal autonomy. I want to make my own choices, Allison said, her voice growing stronger. About where we live, how we prepare for the baby, what kind of life we build together. Together, Victoria repeated, emphasizing the word as if it were a foreign concept. That's exactly what we're doing. Making decisions together as a family. But Allison could see the truth beneath the rhetoric. They weren't making decisions together, they were implementing Victoria's vision of what their family should look like. Marcus might be consulted, his opinions sought and considered, but Allison's role was to comply with plans made by people who claimed to know better. I need some time, she said, backing toward the bedroom, to think about everything. Victoria's voice followed her, sharp with disapproval. Thinking is fine, dear, but don't take too long. These apartments won't wait forever, and good places go quickly in this market. Allison closed the bedroom door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing with the adrenaline of conflict barely contained. She could hear their voices continuing in the living room, probably discussing her resistance to their plans, analyzing her behavior like symptoms of a condition that needed treatment. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. The baby inside her was still a secret between her body and her consciousness, too small to be real to anyone but her. But already its existence was being used to justify decisions that felt alien to everything she had imagined for her future. The conversation with Rebecca had planted seeds of possibility that were beginning to sprout in the darkness of her uncertainty. She had options even if they weren't easy ones. She had a sister who would welcome her, a job that could potentially transfer to another city, skills and education that could support her, and a child if necessary. The thought of leaving Seattle, leaving Marcus, leaving the life she had built here felt both terrifying and liberating. She tried to imagine herself in Portland, sharing a small apartment with Rebecca, building a new life from the foundation of her own choices rather than other people's expectations. But the fantasy felt fragile, threatened by practical realities and emotional attachments that couldn't be easily severed. Marcus wasn't a bad man, just a weak one. He loved her in his way, but his love seemed conditional on her willingness to fit into the family structure that Victoria had created around them. Outside the bedroom door, she could hear the murmur of their continued conversation, punctuated by the rustle of papers and the soft sounds of Victoria organizing their future with methodical efficiency. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring more pressure, more lists, more decisions made by committee with her input treated as optional. The next morning arrived with Victoria's usual efficiency. Coffee brewing at 5:30, the shower running by 6, and the sound of cabinets opening and closing as she prepared what she deemed an appropriate breakfast for a pregnant woman. Allison lay in bed listening to the familiar routine, Marcus still sleeping beside her, and felt the weight of another day in a life that no longer belonged to her. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, Victoria was waiting with a plate of scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and a glass of orange juice arranged with the precision of a restaurant presentation. Protein and vitamin C, Victoria announced, as if Allison were a student in need of nutritional education. Essential for proper fetal development. I've also made you a prenatal vitamin schedule. She gestured toward a piece of paper taped to the refrigerator, color-coded and laminated. Green for morning vitamins, blue for evening supplements. Allison stared at the schedule, feeling her autonomy slip away one organized chart at a time. Thank you, she managed, though the words felt like swallowing stones. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for work, his hair still damp from the shower. He kissed Victoria's cheek first, a gesture so automatic that Allison wondered when it had become his priority greeting. Morning, Mom. Thanks for breakfast. He turned to Allison, his expression softening. How are you feeling today? The question might have been sweet if it hadn't felt like a medical inquiry. Everyone wanted to know how the pregnant woman was feeling, as if her condition were a public concern requiring constant monitoring. Fine, she said, taking a small bite of eggs that tasted like chalk in her mouth. Victoria frowned. You're not eating enough. The baby needs nutrients, and you can't provide them if you pick at your food like a bird. The criticism stung, not because it was harsh, but because it was delivered with the casual authority of someone who believed she had the right to comment on every aspect of Allison's behavior. Marcus nodded along, his face showing the kind of concern that made Allison feel like a patient rather than a wife. Maybe I should come home for lunch, he suggested. To check on you. I'm going to work, Allison replied, surprised by the sharpness in her own voice. I don't need checking on. Victoria and Marcus exchanged a look, one of those silent communications that made Allison feel like an outsider in her own marriage. She recognized the expression, two adults discussing a child who was being difficult. Of course you're going to work, Victoria said, her voice carrying the patient tone reserved for unreasonable people. But you need to be careful. No heavy lifting, no stress, regular breaks. I've read that office environments can be harmful to pregnant women, all those computers and fluorescent lights. The conversation continued around Allison as she mechanically ate her prescribed breakfast. Victoria cited studies she'd found online about workplace hazards for pregnant women. Marcus worried about her commute, the crowded buses, the walking required to reach her office. They discussed her life with the clinical detachment of doctors reviewing a case file. By the time Allison left for work, she felt exhausted despite having barely spoken. The simple act of existing under Victoria's scrutiny required energy she didn't have. Every gesture was evaluated, every choice questioned, every preference dismissed as uninformed or potentially harmful. The office felt like a sanctuary, despite its fluorescent lights and computer screens that Victoria considered dangerous. At her desk, surrounded by the familiar chaos of marketing campaigns and client deadlines, Allison could almost pretend that her life still belonged to her. You look tired, Jessica observed, settling into her desk with a cup of coffee that smelled like heaven and made Allison's stomach lurch. Victoria's morning routine, Allison explained, then immediately regretted sharing even that small detail. She didn't want to become the office gossip, the woman whose personal life provided entertainment for her colleagues. But Jessica's expression softened with understanding rather than curiosity. How long is she staying? The question hung in the air, highlighting the indefinite nature of Victoria's residence. What had begun as temporary support during grief had morphed into something else entirely, a permanent restructuring of their household with Victoria as the director and Allison as the reluctant cast member. I don't know, Allison admitted. It was supposed to be temporary, but now she's making long-term plans. Finding us a bigger apartment, organizing my prenatal care, planning our future like she's going to be part of it forever. Jessica frowned, stirring her coffee with more force than necessary. That's not normal. I mean, I get that she's grieving and wants to help, but taking over your pregnancy? That's crossing lines. The validation felt like oxygen to someone who had been holding her breath. For weeks, Allison had been questioning her own reactions, wondering if she was being selfish or ungrateful. Victoria's concern seemed genuine, her advice based on experience, her intentions apparently good. But good intentions didn't make the control feel any less suffocating. Marcus thinks she's just being helpful, Allison said, repeating the phrase that had become a mantra in their household. What do you think? The question was so simple, so focused on Allison's own perceptions, that it took her a moment to formulate an answer. When had she stopped trusting her own judgment? When had other people's opinions become more important than her own feelings? I think I'm disappearing, she said finally, the words emerging with surprising clarity. I'm becoming the supporting character in my own life. Jessica set down her coffee cup, her attention fully focused on Allison's face. That's fucked up, she said quietly. And it's not sustainable, especially with a baby coming. Kids need mothers who know how to stand up for themselves. The comment hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. What kind of example would she set for her child if she couldn't even advocate for herself in her own home? How could she teach her son or daughter to have boundaries if she had none? How could she model self-respect if she had surrendered hers to keep the peace? The morning passed in a blur of emails and client presentations, but Jessica's words echoed in Allison's mind. By lunchtime, she had made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She pulled out her phone and dialed her sister's number. "Hey," Rebecca answered on the second ring. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I need to make some changes," Allison said, stepping outside into the cool Seattle air. "Remember what you said about coming to Portland?" Rebecca's voice sharpened with attention. "Yeah. Are you seriously considering it?" "I think I am." The words felt strange in her mouth, like speaking a foreign language she was just learning. "I need to know what my options are, practically speaking. If I moved to Portland, what would that look like?" "Okay," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the focused tone she used when solving problems. "Let's think this through. First, housing. You could stay with me while you look for your own place. There are good apartments here, more affordable than Seattle. Second, work. Does your company have a Portland office?" Allison felt a spark of hope. "They do, actually. We have clients here, and I know they've talked about expanding the Portland team." "Perfect. And healthcare?" "I could transfer my insurance, find new doctors." Each practical detail made the possibility feel more real, less like a desperate fantasy and more like an actual plan. "What about Marcus?" Rebecca asked, her voice gentle but direct. The question hung between them, heavy with implications that Allison wasn't ready to examine fully. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe if I created some distance, he'd realize what he's lost. Maybe he'd choose me over his mother for once." "And if he doesn't?" Allison was quiet for a long moment, standing on the sidewalk outside her office building, watching people walk past with their own purposes and destinations. "Then I'll know where I stand," she said finally. "And I'll build a life that doesn't require me to disappear." They talked for another 20 minutes, sketching out the broad outlines of what a move would require. Rebecca offered to help with apartment hunting, to make introductions at local companies, to provide whatever support Allison needed to establish herself in a new city. The conversation felt like opening a window in a room that had been sealed shut for too long. When Allison returned to the office, she felt different, not lighter exactly, but more solid, as if she had remembered something important about herself that had been temporarily misplaced. She spent the afternoon researching her company's Portland office, discreetly exploring transfer opportunities, building the foundation of an escape plan that felt less like running away and more like running towards something better. The feeling lasted until she opened the apartment door that evening and found Victoria waiting with a stack of lease applications and an expression of satisfied efficiency. "Perfect timing," Victoria announced, rising from the couch with the purposeful movement of someone who had been productive. "I've narrowed down our apartment search to 3 excellent options. We can visit them this weekend and make our decision." The possessive pronouns hit Allison like physical blows. "Our apartment search. Our decision." Victoria had seamlessly inserted herself into choices that should have belonged to Allison and Marcus, claiming ownership of their future with the casual authority of someone who believed her involvement was not just welcome but necessary. Marcus looked up from the coffee table where more papers were spread, rental applications partially filled out, credit check forms, security deposit calculations. His expression was eager, excited in a way that suggested he had spent the day imagining their new life in a bigger apartment, a better neighborhood, a future improved by his mother's guidance. "This one has 2 full bathrooms," he said, sliding a listing across the table toward Allison. "And the kitchen is huge compared to what we have now." Allison stared at the paper without really seeing it, her mind still processing the casual assumption that their major life decisions were now group projects with Victoria as the project manager. "When did we decide we were definitely moving?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive. Oh dear, we discussed this last night. The current apartment is completely unsuitable for a baby. Surely you can see that. But Allison couldn't see it, or rather, she could see it only through Victoria's eyes. The space insufficient, the neighborhood inadequate, the entire foundation of her current life found wanting according to standards she had never agreed to accept. I'd like to see the apartments before we apply to any of them, she said, testing the boundaries of her own participation in decisions about her life. Of course, Victoria replied, though her tone suggested this was a formality rather than a meaningful choice. I've scheduled viewings for Saturday morning. 3 apartments, all in excellent neighborhoods with good schools and low crime rates. The efficiency of the planning left no room for Allison's input. Victoria had researched, evaluated, and scheduled without consulting the woman who would actually be living in whichever apartment they chose. Allison felt like a passenger in her own life, strapped into a seat while someone else controlled the steering wheel. What if I don't like any of them? She asked, the question emerging with more challenge than she had intended. Marcus frowned, his discomfort obvious. We'll find something you like, he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to soothe an unreasonable person. Mom has great taste and she knows what we need better than we do. The phrase better than we do lodged in Allison's chest like a splinter. When had she become someone who didn't know what she needed? When had her preferences become irrelevant to decisions about her own living situation? Victoria settled back onto the couch with the satisfied expression of someone whose planning had been validated. Experience matters, dear, she said, her voice carrying the gentle condescension reserved for children who needed guidance. I've been through all this before: pregnancy, babies, setting up a proper home for raising children. You'll appreciate my input once you see how much easier it makes everything. But Allison didn't want things to be easier if easier meant surrendering control over her own choices. She wanted the right to make mistakes, to learn from her own experiences, to build a life that reflected her values and preferences rather than Victoria's superior wisdom. I need to change clothes, she said, retreating toward the bedroom before the conversation could continue. Behind the closed door, she sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the notes she had made during her conversation with Rebecca. The Portland option felt more appealing with each passing hour, each casual assumption that her preferences didn't matter, each decision made without her meaningful input. She could hear their voices through the thin wall, discussing security deposits and moving timelines with the kind of detailed planning that suggested the decision had already been made. Victoria's voice dominated the conversation, outlining logistics and offering advice, while Marcus responded with grateful enthusiasm. Allison realized that she could stay in the bedroom for the rest of the evening, and they probably wouldn't miss her. The important conversations were happening without her, the decisions that would shape her future being made by people who treated her input as optional. The thought crystallized something that had been building in her mind for weeks. She wasn't just losing control over her living situation or her daily routine. She was losing herself piece by piece, choice by choice, until she had become a stranger in her own life. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. Thought about our conversation today. Portland office is hiring for marketing positions. Want me to send you the job posting? Allison stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the reply button. Responding would be crossing a line, taking a concrete step toward a future that didn't include Marcus or Victoria or the carefully planned life they were constructing around her. But not responding felt like surrendering the last piece of herself to other people's expectations. She typed back, yes. Send it. The response came immediately, on its way. You've got this, sis. Whatever you decide. 20 minutes later, Allison was reading through a job description that perfectly matched her skills and experience. The salary was competitive, the benefits comprehensive, the work challenging in ways that her current position had stopped being months ago. It felt like a door opening, showing her a path toward a life where her choices mattered. She was still reading when Marcus knocked on the bedroom door, then entered without waiting for permission, a habit he had picked up from his mother. Everything okay? He asked, sitting beside her on the bed. You seemed upset about the apartment thing. Allison minimized the job posting on her phone, not ready to share that particular development. "I just feel like I'm being left out of decisions about my own life," she said, choosing her words carefully. Marcus frowned, his expression suggesting that her concerns were puzzling rather than valid. "You're not being left out. We're planning everything together as a family." The word family carried different meanings for each of them, Allison realized. For Marcus, it included Victoria as a permanent member, someone whose opinions carried equal or greater weight than his wife's. For Allison, family meant the two of them, soon to be three, making decisions based on their own values and preferences. "Your mother isn't my family," she said quietly, surprised by her own directness. Marcus stiffened, his face cycling through surprise and hurt before settling into defensiveness. "She's my mother. She's trying to help us. After everything she's been through losing Dad, I can't just shut her out." "I'm not asking you to shut her out," Allison replied, though she wondered if that was entirely true. "I'm asking you to include me in decisions about my own life. To consider my feelings, my preferences, my needs." "I do consider your feelings," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just that Mom has experience with these things. She knows what we need even when we don't realize it ourselves." The phrase echoed Victoria's earlier words, revealing how completely his mother's perspective had replaced his own judgment. Marcus was no longer evaluating situations independently. He was channeling Victoria's opinions and presenting them as his own insights. "What do you think I need?" Allison asked, genuinely curious about whether he had any awareness of her actual desires and concerns. Marcus hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "A bigger apartment," he said finally. "Good prenatal care. Less stress. Proper nutrition. Everything Mom's been helping us with." All Victoria's priorities, Allison noticed. Nothing that reflected his understanding of her as an individual with her own hopes and fears and preferences. She had become a pregnancy to be managed rather than a person to be loved and supported. "What about what I want?" she pressed. "What do you want?" he asked, and the question sounded genuine, as if he had never considered that her wants might differ from what Victoria deemed appropriate. Allison looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a man who had become a stranger. The person who had once listened to her dreams and supported her ambitions had been replaced by someone who saw her as a project requiring expert management. "I want to make my own choices," she said simply. "About where we live, how we prepare for the baby, what kind of life we build together. I want to be treated like an adult whose opinions matter." Marcus's expression suggested that her wants were unreasonable, possibly selfish. "You can make choices," he said, his voice taking on the patient tone reserved for difficult people. "But you have to be practical. Mom's suggestions make sense." "To you," Allison replied. "They make sense to you. But you haven't asked what makes sense to me." The conversation continued in circles, Marcus defending his mother's involvement while failing to understand why Allison found it problematic. Every concern she raised was met with explanations of Victoria's good intentions, her superior experience, her desire to help. None of his responses acknowledged that good intentions didn't justify control, that experience didn't grant authority over someone else's life, that help should be offered rather than imposed. By the time they went to bed, nothing had been resolved. Marcus fell asleep quickly, exhausted by a conversation that had challenged assumptions he wasn't prepared to examine. Allison lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling and listening to Victoria's movements in the next room, the sound of someone settling in for the long term. The next morning brought more of the same. Victoria had prepared a breakfast schedule for the week, ensuring that Allison received proper nutrition at appropriate intervals. She had researched prenatal yoga classes and made appointments for apartment viewings. She had created a timeline for baby preparations that stretched from the current moment through the child's first birthday. Every detail had been planned with meticulous care and absolute authority. Allison's role was to comply, to be grateful, to trust that Victoria knew best. Her own preferences were treated as misguided impulses that would be corrected through patient education and firm guidance. By Friday afternoon, Allison had made up her mind. She called Rebecca from the office bathroom, the only place where she could guarantee privacy. "I want to do it," she said without preamble. "The Portland thing. I want to apply for the job and make a plan to leave." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, and Allison could picture her sister processing the weight of the decision. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "This is big, Allison. Life-changing big." "I'm already living through life-changing big," Allison replied. "The question is whether the changes are going to be my choice or someone else's." They spent the lunch hour creating a concrete plan. Allison would apply for the Portland position that afternoon. If she got an interview, she would use a sick day to travel down and meet with the company. If she got the job, she would give her current employer 2 weeks' notice and begin the process of extricating herself from her Seattle life. "What about Marcus?" Rebecca asked, echoing the question that Allison had been avoiding. "I'll tell him once I know I have options," she said. "If I get the job offer, I'll explain what I need from him: boundaries with his mother, respect for my autonomy, a marriage where my voice matters. If he can't provide that, then at least I'll have somewhere to go." The plan felt both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in months, Allison was taking action based on her own assessment of her situation rather than accepting other people's definitions of what she needed. The outcome was uncertain, but the process was hers. She submitted her job application that afternoon, crafting a cover letter that highlighted her marketing experience and expressed genuine enthusiasm for the Portland company's mission. The act of applying felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been missing, the part that knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to pursue it. The weekend apartment viewings proceeded according to Victoria's schedule. 3 apartments in neighborhoods that met her criteria for safety, schools, and general suitability for raising children. Marcus was enthusiastic about each option, asking questions about lease terms and security deposits as if the decision had already been made. Allison participated in the viewings with polite interest, commenting appropriately on closet space and kitchen layouts while mentally calculating the cost of Portland apartments she had researched online. The Seattle options were nice enough, bigger and newer than their current place, but they felt like prison cells designed to contain a life she no longer wanted. "This one has the best schools," Victoria announced as they toured the 3rd apartment, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex that looked like it had been designed by committee to offend no one and delight no one. "And the rent is manageable if you're careful with your budget." Manageable, Allison noted, according to a budget that Victoria had created without consulting her about her actual income, expenses, or financial priorities. The older woman had simply decided what they could afford based on her own calculations and expectations. "What do you think?" Marcus asked as they stood in the empty living room, afternoon light filtering through windows that faced the parking lot. Allison looked around the space, trying to imagine herself living there, raising a child there, building a life there under Victoria's continued supervision. The apartment was fine, better than fine, objectively speaking. Larger than their current place, in a good neighborhood, with amenities that would make daily life easier. But it felt like a trap disguised as an upgrade, a more comfortable cage that would make her confinement less obvious but no less complete. Victoria would have even more space to organize and manage, more rooms to fill with her opinions and preferences, more opportunities to shape their daily routines according to her superior wisdom. "It's nice," Allison said finally, the words feeling like betrayal of her own instincts. Victoria clapped her hands together, a gesture of satisfaction and accomplishment. "Wonderful. We can submit the application this afternoon. I've already prepared most of the paperwork." Of course she had. Victoria's efficiency knew no bounds, and Allison's input was merely a formality in processes that had already been completed in the older woman's mind. They drove home in Victoria's car, Marcus in the passenger seat discussing lease terms while Allison sat in the back like a child being transported to activities planned by adults. That evening, while Victoria prepared what she deemed an appropriate dinner for a pregnant woman and Marcus watched television, Allison checked her email and found a response from the Portland company. They wanted to schedule a phone interview for Monday afternoon. She stared at the message, her heart racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The interview was real, the opportunity concrete, the path toward independence suddenly illuminated with specific steps and timelines. On Monday, she called in sick and spent the morning preparing for the interview. She researched the company's recent campaigns, prepared thoughtful questions about their Portland office culture, and practiced articulating her qualifications with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. The conversation went better than she had dared to hope. The hiring manager was impressed with her portfolio, interested in her ideas for expanding their client base, and enthusiastic about the fresh perspective she could bring to their team. They scheduled an in-person interview for the following week. "We're looking to fill this position quickly," the manager explained. "The right candidate could start as early as next month." Next month. The timeline felt both impossibly fast and urgently necessary. By next month, she could be living in Portland, working for a company that valued her contributions, building a life where her choices mattered. The possibility felt like a light at the end of a tunnel she hadn't realized she was trapped in. That evening, she sat through dinner listening to Victoria's detailed analysis of apartment lease terms and Marcus's grateful acceptance of his mother's guidance. They discussed security deposits and moving timelines as if Allison's agreement was a foregone conclusion, her participation in the decision-making process unnecessary. "I've prepared a moving checklist," Victoria announced, producing yet another laminated document from her apparently endless supply of organizational tools, color-coded by priority level and timeline. "If we're efficient about it, we can be completely settled before the baby arrives." Allison stared at the checklist, seeing her future mapped out in someone else's handwriting, organized according to someone else's priorities, scheduled according to someone else's vision of what her life should look like. The baby was still months away, but already its existence was being used to justify decisions that felt alien to everything she wanted for herself and her child. "Actually," she heard herself say, surprising everyone including herself, "I need to talk to you both about something." The room went quiet, Marcus and Victoria turning their attention to her with the focused concern of people preparing to address a problem. Allison felt their expectation that whatever she needed to discuss would be quickly resolved so they could return to the important business of planning her future. "I've been thinking about the move," she began, choosing her words carefully, "and I'm not sure it's what I want." Victoria's expression shifted through surprise, concern, and what looked like pity for someone who clearly didn't understand her own best interests. "Dear," she said in the patient tone reserved for the confused, "we've been over this. The current apartment isn't suitable for a baby." "Maybe not," Allison replied, her voice growing steadier as she found her footing. "But that doesn't mean I have to accept your solution. There might be other options, other ways of handling the situation that would work better for me." Marcus frowned, his discomfort obvious. "What other options?" "Mom's found great apartments, and we can afford them if we're careful. I don't understand what the problem is." The problem, Allison realized, was that they couldn't see her as an independent person with her own agency and preferences. She had become a project to be managed, a problem to be solved, a woman whose pregnancy required expert supervision and guidance. "The problem," she said slowly, "is that nobody's asked what I want. You've researched apartments, calculated budgets, and made plans without considering whether I agree with your assessment of what we need." Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive. "Of course we want to know what you want. But you have to be realistic about your situation. Pregnancy affects judgment, dear. Hormones can make women think they want things that aren't actually good for them." The comment landed like a slap. Allison felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment, the casual dismissal of her mental faculties stinging more than outright insult would have. According to Victoria, pregnancy had rendered her opinions unreliable, her preferences suspect, her judgment compromised by biological processes beyond her control. "My judgment is fine," Allison said, her voice sharp with indignation. "And my hormones don't make me incapable of knowing what I want for my own life." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, caught between his wife's anger and his mother's certainty. "Maybe we should talk about this later," he suggested, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to defuse a situation he didn't understand. No, Allison replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. We should talk about it now. I'm tired of having conversations about my life when I'm not really included in them. Victoria's expression hardened, her patience clearly wearing thin. You are included. We've discussed every decision, explained every choice. Just because you don't like our conclusions doesn't mean you haven't been part of the process. But Allison could see the truth beneath Victoria's rhetoric. She had been informed of decisions, not included in making them. She had been expected to accept explanations, not contribute her own analysis. She had been treated like a student receiving education rather than an adult participating in choices that would shape her future. I want to make my own decisions, she said, the words feeling like a declaration of independence. About where I live, how I prepare for the baby, what kind of life I want to build. And I want those decisions to be respected, even if you don't agree with them. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like dust after an explosion. Victoria's face cycled through emotions too quickly for Allison to track, while Marcus stared at his wife as if she had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language. What exactly are you saying? He asked finally, his voice careful and controlled. Allison took a deep breath, gathering courage for words that would change everything. I'm saying that I need space to figure out what I want without constant input from people who think they know better than I do. I need to feel like my own life belongs to me. Victoria rose from her chair with the purposeful movement of someone preparing to address a crisis. This is exactly what I was worried about, she announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose predictions had been validated. Pregnancy hormones can cause women to make irrational decisions, to push away the people who care about them most. The casual pathologizing of her desire for autonomy felt like gasoline on the fire of Allison's anger. She was tired of being treated like a medical condition rather than a person, tired of having her legitimate concerns dismissed as symptoms of biological instability. This isn't about hormones, she said, rising to face Victoria across the small living room. This is about respect. About being treated like an adult whose opinions matter, whose preferences count, whose voice deserves to be heard in decisions about her own life. Marcus stood as well, his movements uncertain, as if he wasn't sure which side of the confrontation he should occupy. Allison, please. Let's all calm down and discuss this rationally. But Allison was done with discussions that prioritized calm over truth, rationality over authenticity. She was done pretending that Victoria's control was help, that Marcus's compliance was support, that her own desires were unreasonable obstacles to be overcome. I am being rational, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. I'm rationally concluding that I can't continue living like this, being managed and organized and planned for as if I'm incapable of making my own choices. Victoria's expression shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with determination. Dear, you're obviously overwhelmed. Pregnancy is difficult, and it's natural to feel confused about what you need. That's why you need experienced guidance, people who can help you see the situation clearly. The condescension in her voice was so thick that Allison wondered how she had ever mistaken it for kindness. Victoria wasn't offering help. She was asserting dominance, using Allison's pregnancy as justification for claiming authority over her life. I see the situation perfectly clearly, Allison replied. And what I see is that my husband has chosen his mother's comfort over his wife's autonomy, and I'm expected to accept that as normal and healthy. Marcus flinched as if she had struck him. That's not fair. I'm trying to balance everyone's needs. No, Allison said, shaking her head. You're prioritizing your mother's needs and expecting me to adapt. There's a difference. The confrontation continued for another 20 minutes, voices rising and falling as positions hardened into battle lines. Victoria insisted that Allison's resistance to guidance was dangerous to both mother and child. Marcus pleaded for patience and understanding, unable to see that his wife's requests were reasonable. Allison fought for recognition of her basic right to self-determination, to have her voice heard and her choices respected. By the end, nothing had been resolved except Allison's growing certainty that the life she was living was not the life she wanted for herself or her child. She retreated to the bedroom while Victoria and Marcus continued their discussion in the living room, their voices low but urgent as they diagnosed her behavior and planned their response. Allison sat on the edge of the bed and checked her email, finding a message from the Portland company confirming her in-person interview for Thursday. She replied immediately, accepting the appointment and requesting information about their relocation assistance program. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air, terrifying and liberating in equal measure. She was committed now to exploring a future that didn't include Victoria's management or Marcus's compliance. Whether that future would ultimately include Marcus at all remained to be seen, but it would definitely include her own voice, her own choices, her own definition of what kind of life she wanted to build. Outside the bedroom door, she could hear them discussing her behavior with the clinical detachment of people analyzing a problem that needed solving. They were probably right about one thing: she was changing, becoming someone different from the accommodating woman who had once accepted other people's definitions of what she needed. But change, she was beginning to realize, wasn't necessarily a problem to be solved. Sometimes it was an evolution to be embraced, a growth toward becoming the person she had always been meant to be. And if that person couldn't coexist with Victoria's need for control or Marcus's inability to stand up for his wife, then perhaps it was time to discover what life looked like when she was the one making the important decisions. The Portland interview was scheduled for Thursday at 2 o'clock. Allison had 3 days to prepare for the conversation that might change everything, 3 days to gather the courage to pursue a future that belonged entirely to her.